Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to stage your MC for the day, Vice President and Publisher for Automotive News, Jason Stein.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And by the way, Craig had mentioned it earlier, but these are at the back of the room, Industry 4.0 in automotive, a collaboration that we did with Deloitte now for a number of years. And you'll find them right at the table at the back. I think you'll find some enormously powerful, meaningful insights that are in here for you to read. So with that, we continue our exploration into smart mobility, and we turn our attention to those mobility ecosystems, the infamous ecosystems, right? How do you scale innovation and mobility in a real-world sandbox and gain meaningful output? And our next session here is going to examine real-life examples of how public and private leaders in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, sorry about the Cowboys, everybody, are partnering to make, Mike McCarthy is going to be your new coach, to make integrated mobility ecosystems a reality. And while they're doing it, they are generating billions of dollars in economic impact, creating thousands of jobs. A fantastic discussion awaits, and moderating it for us is Nishita Henry, Chief Innovation Officer at Deloitte Consulting. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Jason. Happy New Year, everybody. I'm really excited to be facilitating this panel this morning with these esteemed panelists. As we reflect on the last decade, mobility has been a conversation for many years. We've talked about it in terms of automotive, automation, connected technologies, but as we enter this new decade, we're really talking about ecosystems and what will really drive us into the future. So today, we have a great representation of the ecosystem from industry, whether it's services or products, from government, as well as real estate development. So without further ado, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, just talk a little bit about their role in the mobility ecosystem, and then we'll get started. Mike, I'll start with you.
Good morning. I'm Mike Berry with Hillwood. We're a real estate development company based in the Fort Worth, Dallas area. We became involved in mobility actually 30 years ago when we developed in partnership with the city of Fort Worth and the FAA Alliance Airport, which was the first true public-private industrial airport to be built in this country. And from that development, from the development of the airport, we've evolved what is now a 26,000-acre master plan development that's set with the airport at its core, that now is a fully integrated multimodal logistics and e-commerce center. And with all of the transformation going on in mobility and logistics, we have tried to go to the next level with our strategy. We partnered with Deloitte last year in the spring, and we're standing up now around this alliance platform a fully integrated mobility innovation zone where we're working with our existing customers like Bell, BNSF, Railway, Amazon, FedEx, UPS, and many, many others to bring everyone together, and Hillwood's role is really a convener in that initiative.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Brant Ring, and I'm with BNSF Railway, which is one of 7 Class 1 freight railroads that really serves the western half of the United States. My role at BNSF is to help us maintain our competitive position by finding new ways of doing what we do, deploying emerging technology, and leveraging strategic initiatives to maintain our cost control, make us a safer railroad, make us more efficient. But that assignment is really just a few weeks old. Prior to that, and how I came to engage with the Mobility Innovation Zone is I was in part of our service delivery team. So as part of those responsibilities, I had oversight and responsibility for intermodal terminal operations, where we load and unload trailers and containers to and from our rail network at the endpoints that come to and from warehousing and distribution centers, of which Alliance is a major logistics park for us, where it's anchored with the industrial operation, the intermodal terminal that we have there in Alliance, and it's surrounded by all the retailers that Mike referenced in terms of the warehousing and distribution centers that are around that. And we've had some luck and some good fortune in deploying some emerging technologies in those operations to streamline our operations. And with that success that we've had, we think there's a way to do that outside the 4 walls of our operations, so to speak, and connect with our customers and shippers at their facilities, connect our operations to their operations and things in between, with some emerging technology that streamlines the supply chain overall.
Great. Mayor Price?
Howdy. I'm Betsy Price. I'm the mayor of Fort Worth, Texas. And my job is to figure out how do we take advantage of all this capital, all this knowledge, to serve the nearly 900,000 citizens of Fort Worth. We are now the 13th largest city in the nation and rapidly growing. The estimate is that we will be the 11th city. We've moved from 725,000 residents 8 years ago to 900,000 now. And you're never going to build enough concrete, enough rail to accommodate that kind of rapid growth. And in a new environment where we find ourselves now, you have to come to the table. And government is not there in a technology world to regulate everything. We have to be there to try to facilitate, to bring the right people to the table, to see that we're getting the right workforce there, which we're going to get into a little bit more. But our job is, as Mike said, he's the convener. Our job is to ride herd on the upper level of it, to try to keep our citizens going, their children have additional jobs, and make it a great place to live. So come see us.
Good morning. I'm Chad Sparks from Bell, and we are an 80-plus year aerospace OEM developing vertical lift solutions for many, many decades now, both for traditional defense applications and for commercial. And my role within Bell is really structuring business partnerships and understanding how we navigate this new innovative space for aerospace, where ultimately our goal is to make vertical lift safe, affordable, and accessible for not just people, but for moving people and goods and data in a seamless and efficient way across a transportation network.
Good morning. My name is Rashik Zarif with Deloitte, leading future mobility in the tech sector. And our role really focuses on combining the various mobility opportunities that are out there for cities, and most importantly, when it comes to autonomous technologies and when it comes to emerging technologies, seeing how that all interconnects together. And specifically, what's important for today's panel conversation is how does this work in an ecosystem setting?
Great. Thank you all. Okay, Rashik, I'm going to start with you to help us set the stage, right? We talked about the last decade and where we've come and where we are today in mobility. What are some of the trends you're seeing, and what is changing, and what should we be prepared for in this new decade?
Thanks, Nishita. We've all seen in the last decade the onslaught of mobility companies coming about and changing the way we move, both in the movement of people and the movement of goods. Whether it's the ride-hailing companies, on-demand transit, we see a lot in the logistics space that has really transformed how do we get what we need. But they've all been done in silos. Everyone has kind of worked in their respective swim lanes, and that's not sustainable in the future. There needs to be some sort of collaboration, but in a world of competitiveness, how do you get collaboration? How do you get people to work together when they're trying to be able to take each other's business? And this is where, from an ecosystem standpoint, we see the next decade being a real game changer in how everyone tends to, how they'll be able to focus on overlapping on each other's verticals while still being able to grow all the respective businesses. The emerging technology that keeps coming in is still pretty much coming in full force. I know there's some questions about whether capital is being reduced in the sense of investments. I see it more of as we're just being a bit more focused. But the way to accelerate, especially when it comes to mobility, is to be able to have a place, and that's key, a place where you can all work together and figure out how does everything connect.
Great. I know you referred to the competition or cooperation, right? Co-opetition, and how do we do that effectively for the benefit of all of us? So, Brant, I'm going to go to you, right? As a rail system, how do you see this impacting your business, and how are you making an impact on the future of mobility?
You bet, and I'd like to touch a little bit on that last question in terms of, I'll start with what's actually not changing. And what that is in the supply chain, the freight supply chain continues to look for three things: capacity, consistency of service, and efficiency. And that has been consistent throughout the supply chain history. What's beginning to emerge now, though, are technologies that allow us to streamline the interface points. So anytime in the supply chain where there's an exchange or an interchange of an asset, whether that's a trailer or a container or a piece of freight, or an interchange of information flows, those handoffs represent friction, which represent inefficiency for the overall supply chain. And so what we're starting to see emerge in our operation is the ability to connect systems, devices, and information flows to not only improve our operations, but connect with our shippers, connect with our channel partners to streamline those interchange points and those handoff points to make the supply chain much more efficient, give the supply chain more capacity and more consistency along the way.
Got it. So that's the connectedness of information.
That's right.
Chad, how about from your perspective?
From Bell's perspective, I think there are probably 3 ways that we are really seeing disruption in our traditional business today that we're needing to embrace from an innovation standpoint. The first is on a vehicle technology paradigm. So when you think about what is needed in this future state, the big trends around electrification of propulsion systems on vehicles is a strong emphasis for us on developing and maturing a supply chain around that. That's not just battery technology, but that's the entire string of batteries to motors on a vehicle. The other area that's important from a supply chain perspective that we're seeing a lot in is sensor integration. Many of the types of vehicles we're envisioning in the future that are unmanned in some capacity require a much higher level of sensor and sensor fusion in order to create situational and environmental awareness around the vehicle. So there's a big piece on the supply chain side that we're working to develop. The next layer above that, though, is really about it's not just about the vehicle. I have all the confidence in the world that Bell can develop and build a really compelling vehicle, but we need the infrastructure to support this new generation of vehicles, and that spans everything from what does the ground-based infrastructure look like for these vehicles to land, and these vehicles to charge, and these vehicles to integrate into a traffic management system in a seamless and frictionless way. It also means, how do we create the right digital backbone behind that can manage all of the data that we're going to create and actually create business intelligence out of that data so that, again, we can drive efficiencies in really meaningful ways. And ultimately, kind of the third piece of that is really about how do we create not just a vertical lift solution, but a transportation-based solution. Bell realizes that we're only one piece of the puzzle, and we need to make sure that we have really tight relationships with folks like BNSF and others so that we ultimately create a transportation solution set that envisions all of the intermodalities that are needed and all of the connectivity that's needed across the entire network to really drive the efficiencies needed at the end of the day.
Great. So both of you talked about supply chain and some of the partners around that. Rashik started with some of that co-opetition. Can you guys, Chad or Brant, just comment on kind of how you see new entrants in the market from a technology perspective that are bringing some of the disruption, and how do you work with them while at the same time knowing you're competing with them? If you have any thoughts on that.
Well, for our operations, I mean, we've had some success in terms of deploying some very advanced technology. I mean, if you think about an intermodal terminal that loads and unloads trains, there's really 4 categories of how that works. That's how does the shipment get in and out of our facility? That's a checkpoint. How do we know what inventory is on the facility? And then how do we move the inventory on the property? And then how do we load the trains? And we're really seeing the emergence of a lot of technology that allows us to automate all of those operations. So we can actually automate the access or the checkpoint operation so that a trucking company bringing us a shipment for loading doesn't have to interface with a human or a kiosk anymore. And so through all of those, we have pilots underway to automate each piece of that. But that's just one part of the supply chain. So if we improve our operation, that's good. But the real impact for the supply chain is how do we take those technologies and connect to the drivers or the motor carriers that are coming to us? How do we connect to the warehouses and distribution centers that surround our facility so that we share information back and forth? And so that's what we're starting to see in terms of our interest in the ecosystem is the ability to convene all of those stakeholders and develop solutions that optimize the individual operations, but also then optimize the interfaces between those operations.
Got it. Chad, any comments?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that we really try to balance when we're looking at how to embrace all of the new technologies that are coming at us today. And we start, because of our history in aviation, we start with safety first in every application. And so there's a balancing act that we navigate very carefully about leveraging technology that's coming out of traditional aerospace development houses and also evaluating where potential startups and folks that are really out on the edge of trying to bring new things to light so that we can meet in the middle in terms of trying to, in case of a startup that may not have a rich and deep aerospace experience, to help them understand how do you achieve the level of safety that's really required in an aviation application? How do we help them walk that process and understand the rigor that's required behind that in order to ultimately put a vehicle in the air that is safe and reliable and ultimately affordable as part of that.
Great. All right, so let's start talking about the sandbox and how we're bringing all this together. So, Mike, I'm going to turn to you to talk a little bit about Alliance Texas. What is it, and what's so unique about it?
Well, I'll go back just quickly in history. I mentioned that we built the first public-private airport to be built in this country. We actually built and opened that Fort Worth Alliance Airport in 1989, so it's been 30 years. I don't look that old, do I? But at the time, it was very innovative, and yet it was still a traditional airport, but designed for industrial users as opposed to passenger, traditional commercial. The key things that we had that made it unique for us and has allowed us to evolve it now into this 26,000-acre sandbox that we're trying to take to the next generation is our relationship with the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railway, who built, shortly after the airport was opened, this huge intermodal hub that Brant referred to, which is now on par as an inland port, on par in terms of volume with the Port of Houston. So the volume of freight that is now coming through the Alliance project caused us to really begin to look at the technologies that were changing in the transportation industry and begin to look at our other customers besides BNSF to see what else was going on. And Bell, we've been partners with for 30 years, and we were watching what they were doing both in the drone space and now in the VTOL space. And then Uber, who is now one of our newer partners, reached out to us and asked us to help them look at what sort of infrastructure system would be needed to be built for the future of urban air mobility in the way of vertiports, power infrastructure, et cetera. So we started to try to assemble all of our historical knowledge about infrastructure development, transportation development, and all of our newer relationships with our leading transportation partners. And as we looked at it, we realized that across the whole ecosystem, if you will, not to overuse that word, but whether you're talking about surface moving people, surface technology moving freight, whether you're talking about the use of drones, or even the future of using VTOLs to move people in dense urban areas, that there was a lot of overlap. A lot of the technology, a lot of the battery, a lot of the systems, a lot of the software was similar across all of those sectors, all of those silos, and yet the people in those silos were not really talking to one another. So we looked at this 26,000 acres that we have with 45 million square feet, 62,000 employees, 15,000 rooftops, 162 miles of road, a controlled FAA airspace, and we said, what a unique place to begin to use all of these relationships that we have both with the public sector and the private sector and try to create a test bed that is unique in the country. And we still think it's unique in the country. I haven't found another comparable platform. But working with pro-business government leaders like Mayor Price and the other leaders in the North Texas region, and then bringing in some real firepower with Deloitte, we began to put together this platform that we think is unique for both the surface and the aerial side of linking these new innovative technologies together.
Yeah, and so what's unique is it's the environment itself, the multimodal aspects of it, the players that are involved, but more importantly, the relationships that you've been able to really cultivate. And so, Mayor Price, to that point, what has government's role in this relationship been, and what is the role in continuing to foster it?
You know, we've been there from the get-go. We were the first city to approve this Alliance Airport, commercial airport that's city-owned but leased back and controlled by private industry. And it was a big gamble 30 years ago for the city to step out and do that. Fort Worth's always had a very entrepreneurial mindset. Our job is to continue to keep that. We are the second largest city with the youngest population. We have more families with school-age children than any other major city in the nation. To look at that, our goal is to look at that big picture, to look at our economic development strategy, which we rolled out 3 years ago, a new economic development strategy with 5 pillars, and 3 of them focus on innovation. The other 2 are on collaboration, and one's collaboration, one's education. And you just have to be there. Government has to realize people turn to their elected officials to say, is this drone that's going to come in my yard, is it going to be spying on me? We have to be there to collaborate, to facilitate, to be able to say, to earn the trust. Our business partners can work on that, but it's up to us ultimately to say, we're going to say yes because we've been sold that this is going to be safe. You have to facilitate it from the quality of life part, from developing workforce, developing jobs, lower taxes, cost of living, just everything, crime. But people have to have the trust that their officials are going to work with the business community, and Fort Worth's historically done that, and the Mobility Zone Alliance is a prime example of that, of pulling together with Hillwood's help and getting everybody there, and we've learned to say yes rather than to say no. Yeah. The classic thing in bureaucracy is to say, no, we don't do it that way. And that doesn't get us anywhere when you're dealing with technology. My first words out of my mouth when staff says that is, why don't we? You know, because that's the question you're all asking as innovators. Why can't we do that? And I think that's government role, is to say, what if we don't do it that way, what can we do to facilitate this? And that's where we're moving to help our partners to grow this region. And we're a very diverse city and a very geographically spread out city, and we've got to figure out how to get people from the inner city 15 miles up the road to the other side of the city to work at Alliance if we need to. And all coordinating, building that ecosystem is a big piece of this.
Yeah, so real life challenges, right? Mike,
real life challenges.
Yeah, please.
I'd like to just add to that for people who don't understand the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So Fort Worth is on the western side of our region. Dallas is on the eastern side of the region, and DFW Airport sits literally in the middle. Mm-hmm. So if you take what you just heard about Alliance and about Fort Worth and expand your lens across the whole North Texas platform, we're a market of 7.5 million people, with really the centerpiece of our whole economic engine being DFW Airport, which is now the 2nd or 3rd largest airport in the country. So we are all about transportation and mobility. And everything that we're doing, both in Fort Worth and Alliance, really expands and extends across the whole region.
And it, you know, to be the petri dish to incubate this so that we move from this crawl to walk to run phase, we're very well positioned because we've got the 3rd busiest airport in the nation. At 74 million passengers at DFW a year. You got the 9th largest and the 13th largest city anchoring. You've got Lockheed's biggest base. It's a plant that's building jets, the F-16s, and you've got a huge military facility. So, but you've got open rural airspace to the west, urban and suburban airspace to the east. It's a great testing place, and it's a great place for people to come together. Where else are you going to find that kind of environment that deals with major airports, defense, industry, and military installation, as well as Facebook's largest data center, Amazon's distribution centers?
Yep.
It's amazing.
It's amazing. It's definitely unique. It's less of a sandbox. It's like a beach, right? So
Yeah.
you've got
It's a beach.
an
It's
incredible,
not a sandbox.
incredible space there. One more follow-up question for you, Mayor Price. You know, you mentioned, hey, there's, you know, the citizen who's worried about, hey, things like, is it going to spy on me, right? How safe is it? You've got businesses and the ecosystem trying to continue to innovate to provide more services. How do you find that balance? And what do you see as your role in stimulating that innovation while also protecting the consumer?
Well, it's that fine line that you always have to walk when you're dealing with government and business and citizens. You've got to find a happy balance, and you've got to develop that fine line of trust with your citizens. They've got to know that you have vetted this process thoroughly and that your partners are in it for the right reason. And then you've got to be able to articulate that. And I firmly believe that elected officials have to be that face to really assure their citizens that this is where it's going. You know, they say, I don't want that drone in my yard, but oh, by the way, I do want my pizza delivered by a drone as quick as I can get it, or a little automotive vehicle on the sidewalk bringing it. So you really have to work that out. No one's got it perfect yet, but you have to be very open-minded, and you got to look at the big picture. If we had been limited to looking at 5 years or 10 years at a time, we would never have opened the lines. We would never have opened the airport. And where we are now is amazing. So now we have to look out. It's that old adage, we have to plant trees whose shade we'll never sit under.
Yeah. It's great. That vision is important. Rashik, you know, Deloitte's been a part of this mobility innovation zone from the get-go. And so can you just comment on what you see as some of the uniqueness of the relationships that's been fostered here and how others may be able to take advantage of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take it a step back for a moment. In the last decade, we've seen a lot of pilots and demonstrations that have been put out there with emerging tech. And they've always been focused on isolated single use cases. But in reality, that's not practical. That's especially when so much investment is going into a lot of these emerging tech, whether it's when it comes to supply chain or movement in the air and autonomous vehicle technology. The way to kind of overcome that is for people to come together and share the underlying architecture, the underlying surface of services, whether it comes to electrification or connectivity. When we talk about 5G, is it going to be a public network, private network, Wi-Fi? Like, how do you do that? And if you have 5 different pilots going on all across the world, or let's just say all across one state, everyone's paying for the same thing 5 times. And that's where the uniqueness that comes with Alliance and the greater Fort Worth region is that you have applications for industrial, commercial, retail. You know, you have the infrastructure to be able to try multiple use cases in one region. And what's unique about it is that it's not one company doing one thing. It's one company working with complementary companies that they would work with along an entire supply chain or across an airspace or across a road that makes it all come together. The challenge, though, at the same time is getting these people to work together, because at the end of the day, this is all people, and they're all trying to like eat each other's business or eat each other's lunch. But I think it goes back to what Mayor Price said. It's trust and the willingness, and also, most importantly, having a consistent vision of trying to achieve something. And from a personal reference, I think the work that we've done in Fort Worth with everybody here on the panel shows that everyone has the right vision, everyone has to trust the relationship, and they have the community backing to be able to develop, and not only to test out technologies, but to be able to scale it in a way that others can look at as a model.
That's great. So let's talk about that and how do we test it out and scale it. So Chad and Brant, from your perspectives, right, what's your role been in this ecosystem, and what concrete examples have you seen of being able to jumpstart because of this Alliance Texas Mobility Zone? Chad, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think what's important as we think about the promise of the Mobility Innovation Zone that's envisioned here is that you know, we come at unmanned air mobility in a very pragmatic and practical way, knowing that what the mobility zone ultimately allows is an operational evolution. That's the thing that probably excites us the most about it is from a regulatory standpoint, we know that we have to navigate through what is likely applications in fairly remote rural environments that allow us to build confidence with the regulators and with the communities that then can progress to suburban and then ultimately urban applications. And whether that's moving, in the pinnacle of all of this is moving people, but we know also that in these early stages we expect many of these applications will start moving goods. And so the application within the innovation zone that already has that very significant logistics footprint to it already, because what's really important to us is there is operational relevance to what we're doing. We can take an unmanned vehicle and go do test flights in a lot of places, and that's interesting up to a point from an engineering perspective, but ultimately we have to put it in practical, relevant environments that allow us not just to vet the technology, but to vet the rest of the relationships around it, to help us understand what does integration truly look like between an air vehicle system and a ground mobility infrastructure of some kind. How do we actually solve for last mile when you're trying to connect both air and ground-based assets as part of it? So those are some of the things that really excite us. Now, in the nearer term, the things that we think are important that these type of systems enable are doing really relevant testing that allow us to unlock scale. And I love the way Rashik talked about scale earlier. For this to work in the grand vision, you've got to be able to unlock this at a much more significant enterprise level. And so this is not one guy flying one drone for one use case. That isn't where we want to be at the end of the day. We've got to be able to do this at a much broader scale, and being able to do that in an environment like Alliance and in partnership with the FAA and with NASA that allows us to fly vehicles not just in the Part 107 sort of under 400-foot level, but to figure out how do we integrate into the national airspace. And we're working on collaborative projects today with the FAA and NASA that will allow us to test pieces of that in that type of environment. So those are the things about the Innovation Zone that I think really excite Bell, because we've got a great footprint partner there. We've got great people that help us solve the last mile, because ultimately for us, this is about where are the complementary pieces of what we do today. And so that ultimately it gets us out of the competitive nature that Rashik talks about to get us to a point where there's greater value across the entire team when we figure out ways to really collaborate in meaningful ways.
It's a great opportunity, too, for regulatory agencies, because we're not the only ones involved in this. Your partners at the state and your partners at the federal government have to be at the table. And when you bring this kind of firepower to the table to sit down with your elected officials in Washington and in Austin, our capital, you can make a big difference. And many times they're saying, okay, well, let's let them try this, and then we can roll it out somewhere else, because you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time.
Right. Yeah, that connectedness across not just a
It's a
local
system.
ecosystem, it's the system overall. Brant, how about you from BNSF?
Right, so I mentioned that we have a number of pilots across our network where we have, frankly, automated the processes. So we have automated checkpoint processes where we are in position. We could interface with autonomous trucks bringing us freight. We are experimenting with autonomous yard tractors to move freight within our footprint. And those are all happening at different locations that are at smaller footprints. And what Alliance allows us to do, and Mike had mentioned this, for our network, we have 25 of these intermodal terminal operations. Alliance is in the top 3. They'll move close to 1 million shipments per year. So they're in the top 3 in terms of the volume, but they're it's the fastest growing market that we serve. And so what Alliance allows us to do is to deploy these technologies to improve our operations in a place where it has real impact for a major market, real impact for our operations. But then as we explore those and deploy those for our operations and sharing that with the ecosystem that's been convened, then we can start to deploy those technologies outside our 4 walls and have really a regional impact. And so we're impacting the supply chain in a very meaningful way in a place that makes sense.
Yeah, the testing is really interesting, right? Is the ability to do things we've never done before, and you got to have a place to be able to experiment. Mayor Price, I'm going to go back to you because you mentioned the whole, local, state, federal government connection. The uniqueness of what's happening in the Fort Worth area. What recommendations do you have for some that might be in the audience from some of those other government organizations on what needs to be done to help incentivize this type of sandbox, beach, and other areas so that we can move this forward faster?
You've got to get in front of your elected officials. First and foremost, every one of you in this room ought to know who your mayor is and who your council member and who your state rep is, and your school board, because that's important too. You've got to get in front of them and you've got to say, this is what we're working on. And then the next person comes in and they begin to see a pattern of getting to know them and see where it is and help us facilitate this, help us pull it together. I think you've got to talk elected officials into really being able to move the speed with which they make decisions, so that, because technology isn't going to wait on us. If we're not, and historically government is very risk adverse. And you can't do that. You've got to realize that you've got to have people in offices who are business friendly, who are technology oriented, who are willing to take the risk to improve their quality of life, and who want to grow their area or make it a pilot. But the real piece is getting to know them and getting in front of them. It's as simple as sending somebody an email or a text and saying, hey, did you know that we're working on this in this space? And oftentimes we don't know.
Right.
And I may pick the phone up and call Mike or call one of the others up here and say, what do you know about this? They're coming in to see me. It's those little triggers that may expand that ability to move that market faster.
Yeah, I think it's a great responsibility to put on all of us, right? And
Yeah,
who you
everybody's
are, who
got to
you
be
work
at the
with.
table on this. We don't operate in a vacuum, and far too often you see the decisions made at the local level or the state or federal level in a vacuum where just a very small group of people are coming in and saying, oh, don't let them do that, don't let them do that. They'll be spying in my windows, or they'll be, dropping things on my kids in the playground.
Yeah.
You've got to have the bigger picture. You've
Yeah.
got to have the assurances those aren't going to happen, but you've also got to have people on both sides of the coin.
So I would just like to reinforce that point that the mayor's making in terms of the importance of those relationships and that connection. So those relationships are the foundation of trust, and there is trust in terms of what we're doing. And it's, that trust doesn't mean that the mayor isn't going to provide some oversight to what we're doing, but it starts from a common foundation of, it's not in our best interest as the industry to put out a solution that's not safe. Safety is paramount for our operation. It's paramount for our company. It's paramount for the communities that we operate in. And folks like the mayor understand that. And so that's the common ground that we start with, and this common framework that we start with. And then from there, we'll be able to build the go forward plan together.
Great. So the title of this panel is Crawl, Walk, Run, right? We've started to describe how the crawling has begun, right, through this experimentation, through these relationships. Mike, I'll start with you. How do we get from crawl to walk, and what does walking look like?
Well, we've got to accelerate it. The thing that I think we've learned over the last year in working on this project is all of this capital ran into the marketplace to fund all of these new technologies, whether it be autonomous vehicles, whether it be the systems that are needed to run the autonomous vehicles, whether it be the drone space and all the OEMs out there, that from garage drone builders all the way to the big industry leaders like Bell. And yet we have not really moved the ball at all in the last year towards regulatory approval of any of these technologies. There's, as everyone has said today, there are these little test cases going out there all around the country, and the FAA has these 9 or 10 IPPs where they're doing a specific use case in a certain market, and you're reading about all of these autonomous vehicle tests in different cities, but they're isolated cases. And I don't think we're going to be able to accelerate to commercialization, which is where there's profitability, where there's an economic case for all this capital, unless we can accelerate the proving up the technologies in real world use cases, back to Chad's point. So what we're trying to do is to use an example where our two partners on the stage, what I originally envisioned was we would take one of the large, like the 70-pound drone that Bell has developed, and we would simulate a small container. You can't lift, that 70-pound drone can't lift a full container off of a BNSF train, but let's chop it up, and let's actually take that drone, let's lift that container out of the BNSF intermodal, and let's take it over to Amazon, and let's drop it at Amazon's fulfillment center, and then let it go through the fulfillment center, and let's break it down into a smaller package. Let's pick it up with another drone, and let's take it to one of our neighborhoods into a centralized urban drop pod. So those are the things that we're working on now that we hope to begin literally putting into practice. So to answer your question about how we go to walk, if we can get that working and we can do it thousands of times over and over and over, granted, it may not be an economic case for Bell, BNSF, or Amazon in this environment,
Right.
But once we prove it up, they can then take it and globalize it, and then it does become economic for all those partners. So that's what we're trying to do now, is move from that crawl to walk. And the only way to do that is to be able to create these simulations where we can do it literally thousands of times and prove the safety case, and the mayor can be there and watch it, and all the other governmental leaders can be there and watch it. We collect the data, we can publish that data, and then we can be a lot further down the road to the run phase.
Yeah, no, that's great. I love the idea of consistently showing the value of the use case, enabling all the partners to see their value. And even if there may not be economic value in that small place, right, you can understand how you scale that and really get it. So it's a great walk.
And the consumer can get excited about it too. The citizens, once they can see that happening in our world, to be able to roll that out on a mass marketing, consumer-focused campaign, I think will begin to get people more.
That's a big deal in today's social media world. These tests, these small pilot pieces that are successful, have to be put out there. People have to be talking about them. We need to be able to say, look what they're doing at Hillwood over and over, because that reinforces people's trust that this is going to be okay. If you just suddenly wait till you've got it going and you're going, we're going to launch this today, then the questions really pour into my office and the rest of my council. But if they've been watching this steadily grow from the crawling stage to the toddler stage to when they're ready to run, then the trust is much more likely to be developed. I know you have to keep things secret, but you could do it where they can see what's going on too.
Yeah,
and it's critical in a city.
Transparency and managing change, right?
Yeah, it's managing change, because change doesn't come easy to most people.
Right. It's hard no matter what. Rashik, watching what's been happening here at the Mobility Innovation Zone and how Mike has described the crawl to walk, right? What would you add as kind of things that need to happen, right? And how do folks in this room get involved to get it to move from crawl to walk?
I'm just going to digress for a second, because from crawl, walk, run, I just had my 50-month-old go through all those stages over the Christmas holiday, and now I can't even keep up with him as he's running
Once
around.
It starts, he's off.
Yeah,
right?
he's gone. So if we can get technology to go that fast, that'd be awesome. But I would say to go from crawl to walk, it is, as Mike mentioned, you kind of have to get all these different pieces and use cases to kind of work together, right? But it's a very, very complex web. Like, as an industry, and we're so used to just focusing on one company developing a partnership with another company and doing one little thing. The complex web of identifying how this technology applies to this use case, that applies to this service, that applies to this city, applies to this persona, and do it multiple times over and be able to oversee that is the only way that you can get into a walk and then a run phase. But the other key thing that's important is that you need leaders that are actively involved in figuring that out. A lot of times, and I'm sure there's people in the room that have executives that says, we want to be innovative. We want to go do things. Now, Jim, go take care of it. That person might not have the ability to make the decisions. So it's upon the leaders to come and get involved and also make the decisions on the spot. And that's the only way to be able to be accelerating into a walk and a run phase. And quite honestly, in my experience with everybody here on the panel, I've witnessed that, and it's amazing to see how it all comes together.
Yeah, so you talked about some of the challenges. Complexity is certainly one of them. That has really been one of the major reasons it's taken so long to let this, continue to get from crawl to walk to run. Leadership involvement. Chad, Brant, from your perspective in industry, what are some of the challenges that you see in getting from crawl to walk, and how can we work together to overcome those? Brant?
So from my standpoint and my perspective, I think one of the challenges that we see is how do you deploy these pilots, these proofs of concept, learn, reiterate, and then scale without restricting all the participants, because each member of the supply chain are going to have pieces of their operation or processes that they're going to want to solve or streamline or optimize with some given technology. And the other member of the stakeholder is going to use another piece of technology. And so it's really not about picking which provider or which technology, it's how do you get those technologies to talk to each other. And so as long as we stay away from prescribing the solution, but stitching together the solutions, I think will allow us to get to the run phase much faster.
Great. Chad?
Yeah, I actually love Brant's comment about interoperability is ultimately kind of the moniker that we like to think of in that space. The other piece I feel like is important from Bell's perspective is that we're flying a little bit into the unknown here, to just readily recognize it. This is not, when I look at the 80-year history arc of Bell, there are lots of different missions and applications that we've navigated through traditional kind of rotorcraft space, and those are all known and well understood by and large. But we're in an environment today now with the application of unmanned vehicles in a commercial space like this that is candidly unknown. And we need the opportunity in places like the Mobility Innovation Zone to explore and experiment and iterate on those solution sets. And I think Brant appropriately identifies there's a challenge there in trying to sync up all of the different players that you're trying to align in that space so that you're iterating in unison, in harmony with each other as you walk through that. So as you come to the realization of, hey, the battery technology doesn't do the mission that I need it to, I've got to put a different type of battery tech. Well, that drives a change to the charging infrastructure that then ultimately, we're going to drive different types of data off the battery management system through a 5G network. There's all these cascading effects that we've got to work really hard in convening groups like this to ensure that we stay aligned with each other. And having that leadership vision at the top level to drive that is key. The other piece I'd say that is important, and Mayor Price hit on this earlier, we have to also be proactive in engaging the regulatory authorities in the right way, and so that we don't so that we influence in a way that starts with safety first, but also informs on how we achieve the end goal objectives here in a way that's safe, but also executable at the end of the day, so that we can truly recognize the economic benefit of what we're envisioning in the future.
And you got to realize, for regulators, for city officials, state, it's a challenging time because you're used to working very linearly. We make agreements, we make regulations, and they follow those. This doesn't work that way. This is, we're working on an innovation path, and so we start regulating or start making what happens, and out of left field comes a whole new technology that's totally changed what you've done. You've got to be very flexible, and you've got to be very willing to say, okay, now we got to make an exception, or we got to find another way around that fairly quickly to keep it moving.
Yeah, change is going to happen no matter what,
Yeah.
right? Whether you plan for it or not.
And every model's not going to be the same. It's kind of like raising your children. If my oldest one crawled and walked and ran, and my youngest crawled one day and got up and ran off next day.
Yeah, can't do anything about that. You got to adjust to each of those types.
You got to adjust to that.
Yeah. Something else you talked about at the beginning, Mayor Price, was around the workforce. Right? So can you talk a little bit about the challenges and the ways to stimulate an educated workforce to enable this type of environment?
Yeah, I think the community we don't run the schools in Texas generally, and in some states, the cities do run the schools, but you've got to be the partner with the schools because our future depends on what kind of workforce they're turning out. So we have to get our business partners at the table. We have to get our educators at the table. So we got to get all our universities at the table and say, here's the real application. You need to know these folks at Deloitte. You need to know them at Bell and Burlington Northern, and you need to have your students in that classroom because these are the demands that we're going to have. And if you're not helping us roll that out in education, then it simply will fail. Because if you don't have the people who can operate that technology, you're dead in the water.
Yep.
It isn't about doing away with jobs. It's about producing new, educated ones, and it's about reskilling those who maybe change their job. And we have to be part of the conveners to say, here's what's going on in the world. You better wake up and pay attention to it.
And Mike, you work with a lot of these various organizations as part of the Hillwood and the Alliance Texas sandbox. What are you seeing in terms of the workforce and workforce development?
Well, I'll give one example of a pipeline that we're building right now. I have already built a big part of it, but I think it's applicable to everyone in this room. I think everyone can go back to their own community and begin to work on this strategy. And we've got a long way to go, but we basically went to the independent school districts, which are the K through 12, and have really started to focus on bringing the high schools into understanding what our big industrial corporate companies are doing and the new technologies and the new types of jobs that they're going to need. And then we put with our community college, we put at Alliance an on-site center of excellence that focuses on aviation, transportation and logistics, and we're finding out from our corporations, our industrial leaders, what are the new skills they will need over the next decade, and then we're putting in place those training programs with the high schools partnering with the community college, and we're trying to create a seamless pipeline so we can begin to take those kids, show them there are new opportunities. The future is not necessarily a 4-year college degree for everyone, but there are great career opportunities with these new technologies that are coming, and if we can feed them into this pipeline, we can accelerate the skills needed in the workforce to make us get to the run a lot faster. And that's something we need to do all over the country. That's just not unique to our
Right.
to our
It
market.
sounds like it's a no-brainer that business ought to be in the schools. It isn't going on nationwide. You visit with other mayors and everybody says we've got a real hole between our education system and what businesses' needs are.
Yeah.
And currently, it's the mayors who are stepping in and saying, let's pull these together and lay them on top of each other so that the workforce is not floundering, that they're seeing what really happens. And kids who live in single-parent families in poverty don't necessarily see somebody going off to Deloitte or to Bell to work, and we've got to help facilitate that opportunity for them to see those jobs also.
Yeah, the importance of bringing government and business together to improve our workforce and
That's
to
correct.
continue to educate is incredibly important. From Bell or BNSF, and any comments on how you're doing that with your own existing workforce to get more agile, to learn these new technologies, and how you're cultivating some of the new workforce?
Sure, I'll go first. I think it is something that we need to be mindful of and consider as we deploy emerging technologies. But I think sometimes we underestimate the workforce's ability to transition. If you think about our railroad, BNSF Railway is a 170-year-old company. The assets that we have in place are, long-term, long-lived assets. Locomotive has a useful life of 20 years. And so the locomotive that we're operating now versus the locomotive that we were operating when I started in 1995, it's much more sophisticated. Yet we have locomotive engineers that have been able to make that transition over time. And so there is an ability for the workforce to adapt as the technology is adopted. But at BNSF, what we think is we need to work with the public sector or the education system to make sure that they understand what kind of workforce we're going the future that we need. And what we see is really this technology not necessarily displacing people, but changing the way they do work. And so as we deploy things like artificial intelligence, that helps us take our workforce from being finders of problems, to where the artificial intelligence can maybe find the problem, and then those employees become fixers of the problem. In the world of automation and automated equipment, the employee goes from being an operator of a piece of equipment to more of a planner or technician for the equipment. And so, the pace of technology development is exponential because it moves at the pace of human ingenuity, but the pace of adoption, it really kind of lags that in some ways, and so it naturally allows the workforce an ability to transition very effectively.
Yeah. I love the optimism, right? A lot of times we think, they're an older generation workforce, they're not going to be able to adapt, but I think we underestimate that, right?
We do underestimate that.
Yeah, the biggest population of users of these devices is those over 60, right? So it's an interesting concept, right? It's there. We've just got to figure out how to give them the right tools and facilitate it. Chad, how about you?
I think there's a couple of really interesting ways to approach this, and Bell has done a couple of things, and I'm going to circle back on sort of how we partner with the community even. There are fun ways to really engage and inspire kids at a junior high and high school level. We just completed back here in October the first Bell Vertical Robotics Competition, where we helped facilitate with 17 different school districts within the greater North Texas area building drone kits, but not just simply building a drone and flying a drone, but we were working with them actively to figure out, okay, how do you program that? How do you modify it? How do you develop a cargo system? And we actually had micro simulations of sort of the things we're talking about here on stage about what is a future air taxi, and can you facilitate that using your little drone, or goods delivery, can you do that with your drone? It was just this really exciting way to inspire kids to think about this future state of the world that they are going to realize as part of it. So there's great ways to partner with the community in really fun and collaborative ways, but there are also ways within our own four walls that we do to reskill the people that we have today. We've got teams that think very deeply today about our future factory and what that might look like when, we project that the level of manufacturing that we're going to require is orders of magnitude different than what we do today, and that requires a completely different skill set. From a just fundamental aircraft design and technology standpoint, we are already collaborating with the school districts about we need people that have got much deeper knowledge and understanding of software engineering and what does that look like? How does that integrate? How do you take that level of comfort that you have with an iPad and translate that to a guy working a piece of robotics or automation equipment in the factory today? And so there's this great sort of opportunity set that's out there for both within our four walls and folks that are coming up through the education system today in North Texas.
Great, super inspiring. All right, we've got a few minutes to close out, and I would like to ask each panelist kind of two closing questions. One, we have a great variety of the ecosystem represented, but there are so much more to the ecosystem that makes this work. So what's one player in this ecosystem that's not represented on the panel that you think we need to more actively engage? And then two, right, what's one recommendation you'd give to those in the audience to help us move from crawl to walk around mobility? Rashik, I'll start with you.
So I would say the one, it's a tough question. I didn't think about it.
Sorry.
I felt like we all had everyone
throw it
here. The one that's not represented here is startups. I think that is something that's really important is that we're representing industry, cities, and it really is the fact that startups are the ones that are struggling the most to try to be able to take their emerging technology and take it to the next level. And I think that's one area that's not represented that we should also take into consideration. I think if I throw it back to you, Nishita, I mean, you being the Chief Innovation Officer and what you're doing at Catalyst, for anybody that doesn't know Catalyst, it is an innovation program that really identifies startups and their potentials and connecting them with the right corporations with respective use cases. And so that's a great opportunity. The second question?
What's one recommendation you'd give the audience around how to move from crawl to walk?
So the second, the answer to the second question is, wherever you are in your business, you're focusing from one angle or one perspective. You really need to have a neutral party that has the reach and the relationships to be able to convene and also to be an integrator. If anybody wants to but it's really important when you take it to the next level and kind of developing an ecosystem, you really need to have ecosystem architects that can envision what you're trying to get to and also have the reach to identify others to kind of bring it all together.
Fantastic. Chad, how about yourself?
Yeah, so I'll start with the tail end of Rashik. So I think the one message I would encourage you to think about, and it's hard. I tell you, as an 80-year aviation company, it's easy to be comfortable some days in thinking that you can answer all of the questions that are posed in front of us today. So I would encourage you, don't let your intellectual arrogance get the best of you. There are so many other folks that we have found on this journey through innovation that have, because they are in these adjacent spaces to us, have brought so much more value when you allow yourself to have that type of conversation with someone. So I'd encourage you, drop that facade and be willing to have those conversations with those folks in these other adjacent industries, because there's a lot of value I think that can be created there as part of it. And the first question.
Who else from the ecosystem should be
Who
part
else?
of this?
The folks that I think have been a powerful player for us has been what you see here is kind of physical infrastructure that's represented here. There's a digital infrastructure that sits behind all of this as well, and that spans a pretty broad spectrum of everything from cloud computing to 5G to a couple of different elements of that. That's another really important enabler, we think, in the future state of this business.
Great. Mayor Price?
Yeah, I think who needs to be at the table, I think the startups really and the investors to help them are critical, but I think educators have to be at the table.
Right.
I think you've absolutely got to have educators listening to these dialogues, finding out what's going on, and beginning to really change how we're educating. And I'm not necessarily talking about university, I'm talking about K through 12.
Yep.
Get them at the table. I think the key takeaway would be get engaged. Don't operate in your own small innovation area or your own company, find out what your elected officials and what your regulators are thinking and how they're going to do this, and give them some input. I said that earlier, but it really is the true backbone to moving products along faster. Anything, your elected officials need to hear from you, and they need to know. And then get the word out so that you correspondingly help them get their citizens more comfortable with the changes that are happening in our world.
Yep.
And run for office.
I love
We
it.
need good people serving.
I love it. And we have a
Vote.
saying. Yeah, we have a saying at Deloitte, we are they, right? Don't start pointing fingers,
are
be
they.
part of the solution. So it's great. Brant?
Yeah, at this point it gets a little bit repetitive, but I would say, who's not on the panel and represented here today would be higher education. They're a very important part of the ecosystem, but they are part of the ecosystem. They're just not on the panel today. I know Mike's done a good job of connecting to the university system there in North Texas. And then with respect to the second question, would just repeat that, look beyond your own four walls. If you're an industrial corporate or a corporate who's looking to innovate, you can do a lot of good things on your own, which we were able to do. But it really wasn't until we connected to the Hillwood team and Mike, and Mike explained what he wanted to do from an ecosystem perspective, that we saw a much more accelerated path to impact than we might have otherwise done on our own.
Great. All right, Mike, close us out.
Red light's blinking, so I won't, anything that I say would be redundant. But I think the key is what you're seeing today. Collaboration across public and private sector is critical to the success of accelerating us from crawl to walk to run, regardless of where you are, what market, what geographic region, and what economy.
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. Thank you to our panel.
Thank you.